student, welcome you to massive open online course on Indian economy. Today I am going to discuss the module on inequality of India vis-a-vis other countries of the world. After completion of this module, you are able to learn the trend of income inequality as well as wealth inequality in India, and also you are able to learn the status of income and wealth inequality in India in comparison with other countries of the globe. And this module also help you to understand what are the major determinants for the income and wealth inequality in India vis-a-vis other countries. The module consists with 5 sections. Section 1 introduces the theme, whereas section 2 deals with the trends of income and wealth inequality in India. The status of income and wealth inequality in India vis-a-vis other countries of the globe is discussed in section 3, whereas section 4 describes the major determinants of income and wealth inequality. Finally, section 5 concludes the major findings. Income inequality is the serious concern not only in India, but also in other countries. Along with income inequality, wealth inequality is also another aspect of the inequality. That is, inequality is measured on the basis of maldistribution of income as well as maldistribution of the wealth. But in India as well as in other countries of the globe, the wealth inequality is much more pronounced compared to the income inequalities. This particular figure shows the status of the income as well as wealth inequalities in the globe. Here we have classified total population into 3 groups: top 10%, bottom 50% and middle 40%. Top 10% means the rich people, bottom 50% means relatively low income group people, and the rest of the peoples are treated as the middle 40% group. If we consider the income distribution of the globe, then the bottom 50% people owns only 8.5% of the total income of the globe, whereas the top 10% people have been occupied 52% of the total income of the globe. If we consider the wealth inequality, then it is more pronounced compared to the income inequalities. The top 10% people occupied 76% of the total wealth of the globe, whereas the bottom 50% people occupied only 2% of the total wealth. Therefore, this economic inequality that observed in India as well as other countries of the globe is due to the disproportionate distribution of the income. And India is the emerging country and fastest growing economy in the world, but the trend of income and wealth inequality is serious compared to a number of developed countries. Now we come to the trends of income inequality in India. The World Inequality Report 2022, they have measured the trends of income as well as wealth inequality in India vis-a-vis other countries of the globe. In case of India, this particular figures shows the trends of income inequality for a very long period, starting from 1900 to 2020. Here the red line indicates the trends of share of income of the top 10% people, whereas the blue line indicates the trends of income of the bottom 50% people. In 1900, nearly 55% income was occupied by top 10% people, but their share gradually decreasing and it reached to the 30% in 1980s. In case of bottom 50% people, they have occupied 15% of total income in our country, but their income share was gradually increasing and it reached to the nearly 22% in 1980s. That is, during this period there is the converging trend in between the share of the top 10% people and the share of the bottom 50% people. But after that, that is after 1980s, the gap between income share of top 10% people and bottom 50% people has been increased. During the recent years, that is during 2020, the percentage share of income of top 10% people was more than 55%, whereas the percentage share of income that occupied by the bottom 50% people was nearly 12%. That is, after 1980s, the gap between the income share of top 10 and bottom 15 has been increased after 1980s. And in this context, the Chancel and Thomas Piketty, they have argued that the inequality in India has increased substantially from 1980s onwards, following the transformation of the Indian economy due to the introduction of the reforms in different spheres in our country. Now, we discuss the trend of the wealth inequality in India. Wealth inequality is a serious problem compared to the income inequality. These particular figures help us to understand the trend of income inequality in India. And for the period 1995 to 2021, we can say that here the wealth share of top 10% people increased from 55% to 65%, whereas the share of wealth in our country for bottom 50% people decreased from 9% to 6%. That is, the top 10% people occupied more and more wealth, whereas the share of wealth of the lower income group of people, that is bottom 50% people, is relatively less. Now, we considered the status of the income inequality in India vis-à-vis other countries, and specifically different regions of the globe. This particular figure help us to understand the distribution of the income across different regions of the globe. Here we have classified the countries into different groups such as Sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia, Latin America, Russia, East Asia, Europe and North America. If you consider the Sub-Saharan Africa, then their income share is 31% lower than the income share of the average income. Whereas, if you consider the North American countries, then their average income is more than the average income of the globe, and it is 315% higher than the average income of the globe. Similarly, the South and Southeast Asia, they have also experienced very relatively lower share of the average income, which is 50%. On the other hand, the European countries, the average share of European countries is 215%. If we compare the gap between the distribution of the income of Sub-Saharan Africa as well as Latin America along with East Asia, Europe and North America, then we can say that the European income is double compared to the income of the East Asia, whereas the income of the North America is 3 times compared to the income of the East Asians people. That is, there is a huge disparity of the distribution of the income across different regions of the country. Turning to the wealth inequalities across different regions, we can see that the wealth inequalities is more pronounced compared to the income inequalities. In case of wealth inequalities, the Sub-Saharan Africa, they have occupied only 70% wealth in compared to the global average wealth, whereas in case of North America, it is 390%. That is, in North America countries, they have occupied nearly 4 times of the average income, 4 times of the wealth compared to the average income of the globe. In case of European countries, the share is 230, that is their share of the wealth is more than 2.5 times than the average income of the globe. Whereas, in case of Latin America, Russia as well as South and Southeast Asia, their income or their wealth concentration is relatively less, and it is half compared to the average wealth of the globe. This is the distribution of the income gap between across different countries. Here we have considered income gap between top 10 and bottom 50 income groups. The deep colored countries shows the higher income gap, whereas the light colored countries shows the relatively lower income gaps. As regards the top 10 to bottom 50 income gaps for all countries across the world, the income gaps in Africa vary from 13 to 15 in case of Nigeria, Ethiopia, Mali, and between 40 to 63 in case of Central Africa Republic, Zambia, Namibia, and South Africa. In South and Southeast Asian countries, India's top 10 to bottom 50 income gap is 22, which is significantly higher than the Thailand value of 17. In case of Latin America and Argentina's income gap is 13, while it is 29 in the neighboring Brazil and Chile. Between high income countries, significant variations are also seen in Germany, France, Denmark, and United Kingdom. The top 10 and bottom 50 income gap is in between 7 and 10, while in case of United States the income gap is over 17. We can also understand the extent of inequality in India as well as other countries in respect of the concentration of the private income as well as private wealth. Side by side, the Gini index of income inequality also helpful to understand the variation of the inequality or extent of inequality across different countries. In the context of private wealth in rich countries, that is we will discuss the private wealth concentration for the rich countries side by side for the low income countries or developing countries. In case of rich countries, the high income countries or rich countries, we find that in 1970 private wealth national income ratio ranged between 200 and 400%. By 2008, when global financial crisis began, these ratios increased to 550% in the countries and peaking at 800% in the extreme case of Spain. This figure shows the trend of the concentration of the private wealth over time starting from 1970s to 2022. Here we have considered Spain, UK, Japan, France, US and Germany are the rich countries, and this line shows their trend of the private wealth. This line indicates the trends of the private wealth of the Spain, which was 400% in 1970s, which increased dramatically to 800% in 2008-9 during the global financial crisis. In case of UK, the concentration of the private wealth also increased over time, likewise the Japan, France, US and Germany. But if you consider the trend of the private wealth, public wealth, then its share is relatively low, and its share was gradually decreasing during 1970s to during 2020. And during the recent years, their share, some of the countries, the share of the public wealth seems to be negative, because more and more public properties is being transformed into the private properties. That is, during the course of the time, the private wealth increased significantly in the developed countries or in the rich countries. If you consider the concentration of the private wealth in case of the emerging countries, then The fact is that the large emerging economies such as China and India experienced faster increases than the rich countries. China has had the largest increase in the private wealth in the recent decades. At the time of the opening up of the reforms of the Chinese economy in 1978, private wealth in China amounted to just 120% of the national income. But by 2020, it had reached 530%, and most of this increase was due to the increase of the housing, real estate and corporate ownership. This increase brings the overall level of the private wealth in China relative to the national income to levels similar to those found in United States and France. The private wealth also increased in India over time, and it also remarkably increased from 290% in 1980 to 560% in 2020. This figure shows the trend of the concentration of the private wealth during 1980s to 2020 for a number of emerging economies like India, China, Brazil and Russia. Here the private income concentration is relatively high in India compared to the other countries China, Brazil and Russia. In the year 1980s, nearly 300% is the share of the private wealth, which increased to more than 500% in the year 2020. In case of China, it is significantly increased from nearly 100% to more than 50% during this period. Similar trend also observed for other two countries, Brazil and Russia. This figure is help us to understand the extent of inequality across different countries, and here we understand this inequality on the basis of the Gini coefficient index. Higher the value of the Gini coefficient index implies higher income inequality. Here we have classified the total countries into 4 groups: high income countries and middle income group countries, lower middle income group countries and low income group countries. And for each of the group of countries, we have ranked the countries in respect of their Gini coefficient value. If you consider all the countries, then the value of the Gini coefficient is relatively high in case of South Africa, and South Africa observed the Gini coefficient value 59.3, and it is relatively low in case of Denmark. Its value is 23.7. That is, we can say that the Gini coefficient value ranged from 59.3 to 23.7 across countries of the globe. In case of high income group countries, inequality is relatively high in case of Chile, Uruguay, Singapore, United States, Israel and so on. And among the high income group countries, inequality is relatively low in case of Denmark, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Netherlands and so on. But in case of upper middle income group countries, the value of the Gini coefficient is relatively higher compared to a number of countries of the high income groups. In case of upper middle income group countries, the highest inequality is being observed in case of South Africa. Its value is 59.3, followed by Colombia, Brazil and Paraguay. And the income inequality is relatively less in case of Iran, Venezuela, China, in the middle income group countries. If you consider lower middle income group countries, India is a country belongs to the lower middle income group countries. Then in this group, the Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Bolivia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, they have experienced relatively higher income inequality. The value of Gini coefficient of India is 46.7. Therefore, India has also experienced higher level of income inequality among the lower middle income group countries, but inequality is relatively less for Nigeria, Bangladesh, Kenya, Algeria and Morocco. of these lower middle income group countries. In case of lower income countries, we have relatively lesser number of countries are here, because the information of the Gini coefficient is not available for other countries. Here the Zambia and Burundi, they have experienced relatively lower level of income inequality in case of lower income countries. That is, this information help us to understand the extent of income inequality across different countries. There is a huge inequality within high income group countries, within middle income group countries, within lower middle income group countries, and even within lower income group countries. If we consider the trends of Gini coefficient over time, then we can observe that the inequality gradually increased for the higher income group countries, whereas there is a strong indication of the increasing inequality of the lower middle income group countries and lower income group countries. This is the distinctive features in respect of the trend of the Gini coefficient, that is income inequality over time. Now we come to the important factors that determine the variation of the inequalities across the countries of the globe. There are different factors are there that are accounted for the huge variation of the income inequality across different countries, and these factors may be classified in respect of economic viewpoint, in respect of demographic viewpoint, or in respect of the government functioning. In respect of economic viewpoint, the important factors that are caused for the high variation of the income inequality are GDP and the growth rate of the GDP, that is level of income and its growth, the price level as well as the inflationary situation of the countries, the trade openness, which is measured by the share of the export and import to total GDP of the country. Along with these three factors, infrastructural development and physical capital formation as well as human capital formation, these are also important to determine the variation of the income inequalities across different countries. Therefore, after discussing the trends of income inequalities as well as wealth inequalities across countries of the globe, we can conclude that wealth inequalities is higher compared to the income inequalities, and this is the serious concern for the future inequalities, because wealth is the basis of the income, and high level of wealth inequalities further induces the high level of income inequalities. And some of the researchers argued that this inequality is because of the political policy. Due to the political policy and disproportionate distribution of the income, there is a significant variation of the inequality of income across the countries. Here the Nobel laureate economists Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, they have emphasized that the collection of the tax and redistribution of this tax among the low income group people to overcome the problem of high income inequalities in different countries.